The other students knew all three languages with three entirely different alphabets. How could they carry so much in their heads? I felt humbled by my ignorance. One day I felt so frustrated in our physics class, still another language, that I pitched my book out the open window. The professor made me go collect it. All the pages had let loose at the seams and were flapping free into the gutters along with the white wrappers of sandwiches. Every week the girls had a hands and fingernails check. We had to keep our nails clean and trim and couldn't wear any rings. Some of my new friends would invite me home for lunch with them since we had an hour-and-a-half break and I lived too far to go to my own house. Their houses were 1,000 years old, clustered beehive fashion behind ancient walls, stacked and curled and tilting and dark, filled with pictures of unsmiling relatives and small white cloths dangling crocheted edges. We ate spinach pies and white cheese. We dipped our bread in olive oil as the Arabs did. We ate small sesame cakes, our mouths full of crumbles. They taught me to say "I love you" in Armenian, which sounded like "Yes ke sugu sirun." I felt I had left my old life entirely. Every afternoon I went down to the basement of the school where the kindergarten class was having an Arabic lesson. Their desks were pint-sized, their full white smocks tied around their necks. I stuffed my 14-year-old self in beside them. They had rosy cheeks and shy smiles. They must have thought I was a very slow learner. More than any of the lessons, I remember the way the teacher wrapped the backs of their hands with his ruler when they made a mistake. Their little faces puffed up with quiet tears. This pained me so terribly I forgot all my words. When it was my turn to go to the blackboard and write in Arabic, my hand shook. The kindergarten students whispered hints to me from the front row, but I couldn't understand them. We learned horribly useless phrases. Please hand me the bellows for my fire. I wanted words simple as tools, simple as food and yesterday and dreams. The teacher never wrapped my hand, especially after I wrote a letter to the city newspaper, which my father edited, protesting such harsh treatment of young learners. I wish I had known how to talk to those little ones, but they were just beginning their English studies and didn't speak much yet. They were at the same place in their English that I was in my Arabic. From the high windows of St. Tarkmanschatz, we could look out over the old city, the roofs and flapping laundry and television antennas, the pilgrims and churches and mosques, the olive-wood prayer beads and fragrant falafel lunch stands, the intricate interweaving of cultures and prayers and songs and holidays. We saw the barbed wire separating Jordan from Israel, then the bleak, uninhabited strip of no man's land, reminding me how little education saved us after all. People who had differing ideas still came to blows, imagining fighting could solve things. Staring out over the quiet roofs of afternoon, I thought it so foolish. I asked my friends what they thought about it, and they shrugged. It doesn't matter what we think about. It just keeps happening. It happened in Armenia, too, you know. Really, really bad in Armenia. And who talks about it in the world news now? It happens everywhere. It happens in your country, one by one, yes? Murders and guns, what can we do? Sometimes after school, my brother and I walked up the road that led past the crowded refugee camp of Palestinians who owned even less than our modest relatives did in the village. The little kids were stacking stones in empty tin cans and shaking them. We waved our hands and they covered their mouths and laughed. We wore our beat-up American tennis shoes and our old sweatshirts and talked about everything we wanted to do and everywhere else we wished we could go. "I want to go back to Egypt," my brother said. "I sort of feel like I missed it, spending all that time in bed instead of exploring. What a waste." "I want to go to Greece," I said. "I want to play a violin in a symphony orchestra in Austria." We made up things. I wanted to go back to the United States most of all. Suddenly I felt like a patriotic citizen. One of my friends, Sylvie Markarian, had just been shipped off to Damascus, Syria, to marry a man who was 50 years older, a widower. Sylvie was exactly my age. We had turned 15 2 days apart. She had never met her future husband before. I thought this was the most revolting thing I had ever heard of. "Tell your parents no thank you," I urged her. "Tell them you refuse." Sylvie's eyes were liquid, swirling brown. I could not see clearly to the bottom of them. "You don't understand," she told me. "In the United States, you say no. We don't say no. We have to follow someone's wishes. This is the wish of my father. Me? I am scared. I never slept away from my mother before, but I have no choice. I am going because they tell me to go. She was sobbing on my shoulder, and I was stroking her long, soft hair. After that, I carried 2 fists inside me, one for Sylvie and one for me. Most weekends, my family went to the village to sit with the relatives. We sat and sat and sat. We sat in big rooms and little rooms, in circles, on chairs, or on woven mats or brightly covered mattresses piled on the floor. People came in and out to greet my family. Sometimes even donkeys and chickens came in and out. We were like movie stars or dignitaries. They never seemed to get tired of us. My father translated the more interesting tidbits of conversation, the funny stories my grandmother told. She talked about angels and food and money and people and politics and gossip and old memories from my father's childhood before he emigrated away from her. She wanted to make sure we were going to stick around forever, which made me feel very nervous. We ate from mountains of rice and eggplant on large silver trays. They gave us little plates of our own since it was not our custom to eat from the same plate as other people. We ripped the giant wheels of bread into triangles. Shepherds passed through town with their flocks of sheep and goats, their long canes and cloaks straight out of the Bible. My brother and I trailed them to the edge of the village, past the lentil fields to the green meadows studded with stones, while the shepherds pretended we weren't there. I think they liked to be alone, unnoticed. The sheep had differently colored dyed bottoms so shepherds could tell their flocks apart. During these long, slow, smoke-stained weekends, the men still smoked cigarettes a lot in those days, and the old taboon, my family's mounded bread oven, puffed billowy clouds outside the door. My crying jags began. I cried without any warning, even in the middle of a meal. My crying was usually noiseless but dramatically wet, streams of tears pouring down my cheeks, onto my collar or the back of my hand. Everything grew quiet. Someone always asked in Arabic, "What is wrong? Are you sick? Do you wish to lie down?" My father made valiant excuses in the beginning. "She's overtired," he said. "She has a headache. She is missing her friend who moved to Syria. She is homesick just now." My brother stared at me as if I had just landed from Planet X. Worst of all was our drive to school every morning, when our car came over the rise in the highway, and all Jerusalem lay sprawled before us in its golden, stony splendor, pockmarked with olive trees and automobiles. Even the air above the city had a thick, religious texture, as if it were a shining brocade filled with broody incense. I cried hardest then. All those hours tied up in school lay just ahead. My father pulled over and talked to me. He sighed. He kept his hands on the steering wheel even when the car was stopped and said, "Someday, I promise you, you will look back on this period in your life and have no idea what made you so unhappy here." I want to go home. It became my anthem. This place depresses me. It weighs too much. I hate all these old stones that everyone keeps kissing. I'm sick of pilgrims. They act so pious and pure, and I hate the way people stare at me here. Already, I'd been involved in 2 street skirmishes with boys who stared a little too hard and long. I'd socked one in the jaw, and he socked me back. I hit the other one straight in the face with my purse. "You could be happy here if you tried just a little harder," my father said. "Don't compare it to the United States all the time. Don't pretend the United States is perfect. And look at your brother. He's not having any problems. My brother is 11 years old." I had crossed the boundary from uncomplicated childhood, when happiness was a good ball and a hoard of candy-coated Jordan almonds. One problem was that I had fallen in love with 4 different boys who all played in the same band. 2 of them were even twins. I never quite described it to my parents, but I wrote reams and reams of notes about it on loose-leaf paper that I kept under my sweaters in my closet. Such new energy made me feel reckless. I gave things away. I gave away my necklace and a whole box of shortbread cookies that my mother had been saving. I gave my extra shoes away to the gypsies. One night, when the gypsies camped in the field down the road from our house, I thought about their mounds of white goat cheese lined up on skins in front of their tents, and the wild oud music they played deep into the black belly of the night, and I wanted to go sit around their fire. Maybe they could use some shoes. I packed a sack of old loafers that I rarely wore and walked with my family down the road. The gypsy mothers stared into my shoes curiously. They took them into their tent. Maybe they would use them as vases or drawers. We sat with small glasses of hot, sweet tea until a girl bellowed from deep in her throat, threw back her head, and began dancing. A long bow thrummed across the strings. The girl circled the fire, tapping and clicking, trilling a long musical wail from deep in her throat. My brother looked nervous. He was remembering the belly dancer in Egypt and her scarf. I felt invisible. I was pretending to be a gypsy. My father stared at me. Didn't I recognize the exquisite oddity of my own life when I sat right in the middle of it? Didn't I feel lucky to be here? Well, yes, I did. But sometimes it was hard to be lucky. When we left Jerusalem, we left quickly. Left our beds and our rooms and our car in the driveway. Left in a plane, not sure where we were going. The rumbles of fighting with Israel had been growing louder and louder. In the barbed wire no man's land visible from the windows of our house, guns cracked loudly in the middle of the night. We lived right near the edge. My father heard disturbing rumors at the newspaper that would soon grow into the infamous Six-Day War of 1967. We were in England by then, drinking tea from thin china cups and scanning the newspapers. Bombs were blowing up in Jerusalem. We worried about the village. We worried about my grandmother's dreams, which had been getting worse and worse, she'd told us. We worried about the house we'd left and the chickens and the children at the refugee camp. But there was nothing we could do except keep talking about it all. My parents didn't want to go back to Missouri because they'd already said goodbye to everyone there. They thought we might try a different part of the country. They weighed the virtues of different states. Texas was big and warm. After a chilly year crowded around the small gas heaters we used in Jerusalem, a warm place sounded appealing. In roomy Texas, my parents bought the first house they looked at. My father walked into the city newspaper and said, "Any jobs open around here?" I burst out crying when I entered a grocery store. So many different kinds of bread. A letter on thin blue airmail paper reached me months later, written by a classmate, the bass player in my favorite Jerusalem band. "Since you left," he said, "your empty desk reminds me of a snake ready to strike. I am afraid to look at it. I hope you are having a better time than we are." Of course I was, and I wasn't. Home had grown different forever. Home had doubled. Back home again in my own country, it seemed impossible to forget the place we had just left. The piercing call of the muezzin from the mosque at prayer time, the dusky green tint of the olive groves, the sharp, cold air that smelled as deep and old as my grandmother's white sheets flapping from the line of her roof. What story hadn't she finished? Our father used to tell us that when he was little, the sky over Jerusalem cracked with meteors and shooting stars almost every night. They streaked and flashed, igniting the dark. Some had long golden tails. For a few seconds you could see their whole swooping trail lit up. Our father and his brothers slept on the roof to watch the sky. There were so many of them, we didn't even call out every time we saw one. During our year in Jerusalem, my brother and I kept our eyes cast upward whenever we were outside at night, but the stars were different since our father was a boy. Now the sky seemed too orderly, stuck in place. The stars had learned where they belonged. Only the people on the ground kept changing.